Of course. Okay, so yesterday we started to look at, right, Polynesia, and we're going to focus on images of power. So images of power. So we talked yesterday about the concept of mana and tapu. So mana is that inner spirit that is contained within a person or an object, right? It's like a supernatural power, but it's inside the person. And then the tapu is a set of rules. This is the ritual that's associated with the governing actions of that object or the holding of that mana or that person. So it helps promote the mana, it helps protect the mana, it gives power to the mana, right? So it's a set of rituals, song, spoken word, dance, ritual ceremony, you know, do this, then this, then this to get this, right? So we're going to look at the moai of Easter Island on Rapa Nui, right? Which is Easter Island. They date from about 1100 to 1600, so 214 in your note takers. Okay. And so this is a sample essay question, right? This is a sample essay question. We're not going to do this one like we did before. But I really do like having a couple of examples of these so that you get really associated with the format of these types of questions. So once again, keep in mind that they always give you something. So this one says the moai on the platform, which is an ahu, is from Rapa Nui, and it says the date, right? Then it has you describe at least 2 visual characteristics of these types of sculptures, right? So visual characteristics mean things you can see, right? Visual are things you can see. If you want to jot down any of those sort of notes on additional sheets of paper to make your life easy, feel free. Sadly, there's not a lot of space other than maybe in the cover of your note takers for that kind of extra stuff, right? Then usually using those visual characteristics, explain who is represented by the sculptures, right? So the key word here is what? Who, right? Who. And when you're answering the who, you're going to address those visual characteristics, right? So I think it is, I think it's Mrs. Modest because she has a big head and they have big heads, right? I think it's Mrs. Modest because she has that blank stare, just like these. Okay, so supporting evidence. Okay. Then explain how art historical interpretations of the function of these sculptures are derived from your analysis, as well as the placement of these sculptures. So this is asking for 2 things again, right? What 2 things is it asking you for? You can take a second. What do you think it's asking for? Anyone? Yeah. Okay. Right down here, it's asking you to complete 2 tasks. What are each of the tasks? What is it wanting you to answer? Right. So it's asking for the contextual information that tells us the function, right? The contextual. What is it about these sculptures that tell us that this is what it was used for? And then notice the word placement, right? Placement, right? They told you in the essay that it's on a platform. So maybe focusing on where that platform is, what that platform looks like, right? It's really nice. They do give you a lot of guidance. Okay? So let's break it down into those parts, right? So once again, the first part is given to you. Then you have to describe the visual characteristics. When you're looking at visual characteristics, those are the things you can see, right? Those are the things you can see. So in your note takers, you might be filling this out in the content area or the formal in the formal element area, right? So the formal element area is kind of the content area here, as well as the form. Okay. So what visual characteristics do we see on these types of sculptures? What words can you use to describe them? What do they have? Talk amongst yourselves. What are some of the things you can identify? Okay, Christina, can you help me? Can we say it a little louder? So they're humanoid, they have a design on their back. Now we can't see that on our example. This is the one on the AP, but I think it's still okay to be able to identify something that you don't see on the actual image, right? This is something that we're going to learn by seeing many examples, so that's okay. What else do they have? How would you describe this to like a 4 or 5-year-old? Well, how would you describe it to them? Big people with hats, right? They are. They're gigantic. They're massive. They've got big heads, right? Here's the list, right? They're large. They're made out of stone. We said humanoid, right? They're abstracted, right? They have large heads. If we nitpick their head, they have broad foreheads, large eyes, thick noses, and lips, right? They appear to be wearing clothing. So they tend to look like they're either wearing hats, like our examples. It's hard to see it in the shadows, but they tend to look like they're wearing belts as well. Now, you were mentioning the design on their back. We think they're tattoos, right? Because that's pretty common in Polynesia. They are very similar in style, but they are not identical. Notice how some of them are taller than others. They do have different facial expressions, even though they have some of the general characteristics. If you were to like look at how they're standing, they've got kind of like a puffed up chest. So I say that they're proud. And they're on that ahu, that they're on a platform, right? So we're going to just describe those symbolic and visual things. That's a big, long list, right? Now, do you have to list all of these things? No, you have to list at least 2. Just make sure that when you list 2 that they're not too similar, right? I wouldn't say that they are large and then say they have a big head and body, right? I try to take another point, okay? So these are some different examples of them. I think you probably have seen this because this is pretty common knowledge now. But when I was a kid looking at these figures, I did not know that they had bodies. I did not know that they had bodies. So what we normally see, or what we have often seen, is these big giant heads sticking in the ground. But when they excavated, they found that they are fully formed bodies, right? And they typically have tattoos on their backs. So this is a different example than the ones in the 250. But you can see bird imagery, which we've seen before in this region of the world. You can see the belt more clearly, right? And we think that it's somehow related to like a big man societies, sort of like power imagery. Yep, wrong slide. There we go. Okay, but I think this example is really nice. This is from the set that we're looking at, right? This is a slightly different angle. What stands out the most to you? Yeah. Right, the coral eyes. They often have these really large, expressive eyes. They're very hypnotic. We see the Near East. We're going to see some very stiff figures as well that have these really large hypnotic eyes. So they seem very similar to these ancient Mesopotamian figures that we'll see. Right? So who is represented and how do we know? We're going to make a claim about the who, and we're going to give evidence based on those visual characteristics. You can talk about different ones, right? To hit your point. You don't just have to repeat the two before. Does that make sense? So you could have 4 different visual characteristics, but in this part, you have to make sure it relates to who. That makes sense? So who are these people? From your research and reading from yesterday, who are these people? Or I guess 2 days ago. I apologize. Does anyone remember? Yes, we think that they are ancestors. And one of the reasons we think that they're ancestors is they have different tattoos on their back and that they look different. They're not all identical, right? Even though they have a lot of those similar characteristics, they're all slightly different. Okay, so we think that they could be ancestors. Now, the tattooing gives a little identification to it, but also when we think about Pacific culture in general, there's so much ancestry worship, right? There's so much ancestry worship, and there are oral traditions that have been passed down about great leaders and great ancestors. Okay, so they also could be rulers, right? They could be ancestors and they could be rulers. What are the visual things that say that these could be rulers? And
the big hats.
The big hat. So these ones in the 250 that we have, I think it's also coral, if I remember right, these big giant hats, right? And so they're also kind of different, but they're not little caps, they're big caps. And we often see images of rulers wearing elaborate headdresses. Okay. So thinking about what is the function and of course, and then how do we know, right? Why are there a bunch of ancestors all over the island? Why are there a bunch of rulers all over the island? Any ideas? Yeah, Anne?
Maybe like they were a reminder for all of the people in like the village or something to like pay homage or like respect the ways of like their ancestors or rulers.
Right. So it's almost like a temple to their ancestors. Okay. It says it took enough, and then it doesn't. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we think that they are to honor ancestors and great rulers. They're on those platforms. And those platforms have often been found to be burial spots for people. Right? Now, interesting enough, they're also, they're located in the hillside, but a lot of these ahus are like on the edge kind of like by the water, right? Because this is an island. And we think sometimes that they're there to watch and protect over the people. Is there anything kind of odd about the placement of this example? Go ahead. Kit.
They're not looking outwards, they're like looking towards people. So they're like protecting them, but they kind of be their backs turned to the outside.
Does anyone have any idea why they might have their backs turned toward rather than away? Nicole, you got it? You have educated guess? No?
Like to kind of like symbolize like protection. That they're facing away.
Well, it could. If they were looking out into the water, who are they protecting their people from? Yeah.
Like outsiders.
Outsiders, sorry, did you have any hand raised? Outsiders, right? If they're facing in, what could that possibly mean? Any educated guesses? See,
Maybe like Tamara or something.
it could be religious, right? They could be they could be watching over their people and not really focused on outsiders. Maybe there's fighting amongst themselves, right? And so they're watching over the people who are living on the island, right? You might know that one of the reasons for the downfall of this society is that they basically ran out of resources. They are on a very isolated island. If you know where Rapa Nui is, it's really an island off the coast of South America, right? I think it's a couple thousand miles off the coast or several hundred. I apologize if I got the distance wrong. And it's kind of isolated by itself. It's kind of out of the way of all the other islands of the Polynesia. And so the resources that they had on the island, let's say wood, eventually ran out. And they overhunted the island and they reused the soil so many times that they really couldn't sustain all the people living on it. So eventually only a small population of once was thousands of people was on the island, and basically colonization, Christianity kind of wiped out what was going on. And so you might have watched, right? You might have watched this video on Smart History. There was an article from British Museum, and then this video. This video was just added because it was actually from a special project. So we're not going to watch it because I know many of you probably already did. But it's a really interesting article or essay, if you didn't get a chance to watch it, about how the power of these figures came from their eyes. And so when I'll call them invaders, when the West came, they would often take the eyes out of them because they were made out of precious materials, or they would do it intentionally, or even people, from the Pacific, if they wanted to take the power away from those, they would take out the eyes, right? And it would like deactivate and take away the mana, right? It would let the mana go, right? It was almost like killing the ancestors' spirits, right? And so in the video, they replace the eyes to bring life back, right, to the spirit, which is tapu, right? Which is tapu because it's an act of doing it. I thought that was quite fascinating. Okay, something easy to understand. I think I'm going to have to pause this. So if you ever watch this at home, make sure that you watch the video. So this is the one that is in the image set. So 215. Okay, so how is the Cape a collaborative project in the community, right? Does anyone see that in the reading? How is this a collaborative project? Anyone know? How is mana created in the Cape? Like, what is the tattoo? Okay. So what they basically did is that they had a group of people who would collect the birds, right? And instead of killing the birds, they kept the birds in cages, right? And when they would molt, or if they needed them, they would pluck away a few of the feathers, right? So there were certain people in the community who collected the feathers and raised the birds. Then there was a group of women who would basically attach those feathers to, natural kind of twine, and they would weave the feathers into the cloak. So we have usually male bird keepers, female weavers. In Polynesian culture, as well as many of the cultures of the Pacific, women tend to deal with soft objects. They tend to do the textiles or the tapa, which is like the woven mats, right? So you probably have seen kind of like natural looking material, fabric, single sheets of this with paintings on them. Typically the women were the ones who wove the fabric and the men would do the painting, right? Now this is not painted, but the women would do the weaving. And then as these things were being created, people would sing songs, right? And those songs would be the oral traditions that would be the tapu, right? So it would be given spirit through song, right? Telling about ancestry and giving that cape its supernatural power. Because like the video said, it protects a god, right? The king or the ruler is a god. And usually the cape was used not only by itself, but with a sash, as well as a helmet or some sort of headdress. Right? So of course, functionality of it, who wears the cape and the helmet, right? Who is the person who gets to wear this lovely thing? Yeah, go ahead. The chief, right? The ruler gets to wear it. And how does it reflect his power and status, right? What's the visual evidence that says he's important? Let's look at him. Let's look at the conceptual image I included. Not in the 250. This is the only image we're getting. And what do you think? How does he look powerful and full of status? He's got a spear, so he's holding a weapon, some sort of emblem of power in his hand. What else? The headdress, right, is large and it's colorful, right? And if you think about how it's protected, right, how does it protect his mana, right? Think about how it's worn, right? A headdress goes on your head, so it protects your knowledge, right? The cape is on his back, so it has his back, literally, right? And that sash goes across his heart, right? So it protects him, right? It signifies his status, but it's also there for his protection. Now, if you were going to go to war, would you want to be wearing a feather cape? Not really. But that tapu protects his mana, right? The songs, the history, how it's placed on him protects him from harm. Sadly, it did not protect Captain Cook, right? So if we were going to describe the form, actually, there's a couple other power images that we'll talk about too, but it'll come after we look at the form. In very basic terms, describe what you see, right? We've got feathers, but how are they arranged? What colors do you see? Go ahead. It does kind of look like wings of a bird. So we have the sunny colors of the yellow, right? What other colors do we see? Yeah.
Black and red.
Black and red. And those are going to come from birds that are local to the islands of Hawaii. right? Because this is a Hawaiian cape, right? And it's in kind of like a very geometric sort of, or very kind of organized status. Now, this is a slightly different version, but to know that yellow is the most expensive feather. And the reason it's the most expensive is it's rare. Those birds are not as common, and those birds, I think, have other colors of feathers to them. And so they only have a few yellows to pick. So it takes a long time to accumulate a lot of yellow. So they're very, very expensive. And then the red signifies the royalty, right? So the red is symbolic of that royal, of the royal power. So you might say too that the cape expresses power because this precious thing, you know, expensive feathers, the royal symbolic red represents who it's for, right? It expresses the power, right? This is King Kamalea, his cape. Notice all that yellow, right? Basically, I already talked about most of this. It was very common for the Hawaiian nobility to wear feather cloaks for ceremonies, but also to battle, right? So it denoted their status as chief. Okay, that is all for that one. Pretty straightforward, okay? The next one, which of course I don't have the number for up here either, is our staff god from Rotunda. This is one of my kind of a really kind of cool one to talk about. What's the number on this one? 215, I think 216. Of course, it won't exit out for me. So 216?
Yeah.
216? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have two images for this one. We have one where it's wrapped and one where it's been unwrapped. Okay, so once again, all of this identification information is in the cover or within the first few pages of your note takers. So sometimes I pass this one kind of fast, okay, because you have it literally sitting right at your seat. You can always go back and add them later. Okay, so this comes from the Cook Islands, and there is a Hawaiian prayer. So notice it's not from Cook Islands, but a Hawaiian prayer, and it says, "Coil, bind, make fast with bark cloth, the bark cloth by which power is entangled. The power is curbed by the bark cloth cord." So it's going to have something to do with that tapa, right? That tapa here is the bark cloth. Okay, so the Cook Islands, if you notice, right, here's Hawaii, and so it's south of Hawaii, right? So why would this object be wrapped so much by bark cloth or tapa? Why would it be wrapped up in all of that stuff? Anyone have some educated guesses or got it from the reading? Why is it wrapped up? Why is it not sitting out like a Magdalene or Magdalene? Any educated guesses? Talk to amongst you. Oh, go ahead, Sophia. To protect it, right? Protect it. These staff gods are not very common. Supposedly, this is one of the only few examples of a wrapped staff god. We do have some staff gods. You can find them in different museums around the world, but there's not a lot of them that have actually been found. It's still wrapped. Okay, so this one's kind of special. It is not only wrapped in the bark cloth, right, which is the tapa, but it also has embedded in those layers feathers and shells, right? And so the bark cloth protects. However, it doesn't necessarily protect the staff god from us or the elements. It protects us from the staff god, right? It protects us. It protects people, right? It protects the power that's within that staff. Because from the name, that staff is a god. And the gods are all powerful, right? The gods bring destruction through typhoons and monsoons. Right? So all of that feather and shell and bark cloth is the tapu, right? It's the ritual that you do to the thing that contains the mana. So what contains the mana? That guy does. Right? His spirit is in that, or that staff contains mana, contains spirit. Right? So the bark cloth is made across Polynesia. It really looks different based on the region. Sometimes it's just, natural fibers and black and maybe like creamy colors, sort of what you see here. Sometimes it's got colors like red and other natural dyes as well. And this object has the spirit of the gods within it. And so this is Manava, right? If you just talked about mana, it would be fine too. But I guess that is very specific to the spirit of a god itself. Okay, so how are both the sexes represented by this object, wrapped and unwrapped, right? Let's look at the wrapped version. Who makes the bark cloth? Women make the bark cloth, right? So women weave the bark cloth, okay? The staff itself is considered to be phallic, right? It's considered to be phallic. So it resembles male genitalia, right? And that's where it gets its power. And some people, not all, but some people believe that the imagery here is people or rulers. Others think that it might represent female genitalia. So it encompasses essence of male qualities and female qualities. Now, the men were typically the carvers because the wood is a hard substance. So the woman wove the tapa or the bark cloth, the men carved the staff, right? And then the object itself has female and male characteristics associated with the giving of life, right? So they give you a contextual image here. So they do give you an image, and this happens a lot in art history. I like this. It gives you an idea of how these things would be used. So we have an illustration. Notice that those wrapped bark cloths are sitting on the ground, right? They're sitting on the ground. And who is seeing these? What do we see in this image? Okay, go ahead. What did I say? Oh, Sophia. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sophia. Right, there are couples. There's a man and a woman. Are they wearing native clothing? No. So these are Westerners coming in, and they've been presented sort of like Captain Cook with the cloak, with these staff gods. And notice how the staff gods are wrapped. So they're being protected, like people are being protected from these things. This one is another example. This is not the one in the 250, but you can see this one looks a little bit more phallic, especially at the bottom here, right? But you can see that they were presented or being able to be viewed. These were then highly revered by the community, right? So when you have a guest, it would only make sense for them to be seated and to witness the power of the staff gods, right? And so here is a communal, right? A communal, it doesn't really look necessarily like a feast, but a communal gathering with all the people coming to pay honor to the gods and to the visitors. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna keep moving on just a little bit here. We're going to identify or look at identity in Pacific culture. And Queen Elizabeth is associated with it. That's why she's on there. Right? So we'll talk more about the quiz later. The next piece that we're going to look at is number 11. This is a terracotta fragment from the Solomon Islands. Notice that this is number 11. This is in prehistory. Right? This is in prehistory. It dates 100 BCE. And it's made from terracotta. Terracotta is earthen clay that's been fired in a kiln. Right? So it was clay that was fired in a kiln. So that tells us once again, if it's fired in a kiln, that this would be a Neolithic society because they would have specialized jobs where people would make the pottery and fire it in a kiln. Okay, so here we go. Here are the islands of Melanesia, because that's where we're focusing today. The Lapita people probably migrated from Asia. We think that they might have come from Taiwan around 6,000 BCE. And they basically lived in this region and moved across it for the next 4,000 years. So it's again, the Neolithic society. Okay, so this gives you a little idea of the fragments. This is but a very, very small section of a piece of pottery. So how is it decorated? How is it decorated? When you look at it up close, you can see that it's not smooth, right? It's not smooth. So it probably is a special thing because it's not generic or totally utilitarian, right? So when you look at it in basic like words, right? You can see that there are a series of circular shapes. There's dots, there's striping and like borders, right? And if you look right here, what is that? A face. It has a picture of a person in it. So there's a face. It kind of looks like a really bad stick figure. It's got arms sticking out like this and a body. That's a lie. At least we only see part of it, right? See the body, right? Now, when you look at this technique, it seems to be carved into the clay. And in the description, it says it's incised. That's what incising is. Incising is kind of a carving into the surface. Okay, so this has incised geometric patterns. It could also have been stamped, so they could have pressed something into this to repeat that pattern very efficiently. And it was covered in red slip. So once again, you guys know what slip is. Okay. Is there any other kinds of decorations similar to this in Pacific culture? Yeah, we see them in bark cloth. We see them in tattoos, right? So this idea of patterning using geometric line, shape, color is from tattooing and bark cloth. Okay, so what's the purpose of these vessels, right? These are kind of replicas, right? They probably were used for cooking, serving, and storing, and they could have been used in feasts related to the dead. And why? Because we found them in burials. But once again, this is speculation. We don't really know. So here's kind of the excavation. You can see bones. So that will help you with this idea of feasts for the dead. And we've seen feasts before in later cultures. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll start with a piece of tapa tomorrow. Sorry. If you have questions on your way out, feel free to ask.